It is the evening of June 6, 1944. A handful of German Panzer Grenadiers lie flat in the tall dune grass above the Normandy coast, staring at something no man was ever meant to see. The entire Allied invasion fleet spread across the horizon like a second ocean. Popular history insists German armor never reached the water on D-Day. Yet these men just slipped through a glaring, unguarded gap between the British Sword and Canadian Juno beaches. They are standing at the very edge of the English Channel, perfectly positioned to cut the fragile Allied beachhead clean in half. If they held the power to shatter the invasion in that single moment, what stopped them from doing it? Why did soldiers who had already achieved the impossible turn around and walk away from the sea? This is one of the strangest, least understood paradoxes of the entire Normandy campaign, a victory that arrived hours too late to matter, carried by men too isolated to use it. To understand why, we cannot start on that darkening beach. We have to rewind to the confused, paralyzed hours before dawn, when the most dangerous armored division in Normandy sat still while the invasion of Europe began without it. Before we begin, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea. Take a quick look at the clock. What time is it where you are right now? Rewind 12 hours. It is just after midnight on June 6, 1944, and the sky above Normandy has already begun to fill with a sound the German garrisons on the coast have never heard before: the low, endless drone of thousands of aircraft engines. Somewhere in the darkness east of the Orne River, British paratroopers are falling silently into fields still wet with the last rain of spring. But a few miles inland, in a chateau requisitioned as a divisional command post, a very different kind of war is about to be fought, one measured not in bullets but in telephone calls, hesitation, and the terrifying weight of an order nobody is willing to give. This is the story of the 21st Panzer Division, the only major German armored formation close enough to the invasion beaches to strike before the Allies could dig in. It is the story of how that division, fully fueled, fully manned, and sitting almost within sight of the coast, was paralyzed for most of the most important morning of the war, and how the few hours it did move were spent chasing the wrong enemy entirely. For the men inside that division, the night had already felt wrong long before the first bombs fell. Anti-aircraft crews further inland had spent hours watching searchlights sweep a sky thick with the drone of engines, far more aircraft than any single raid had ever carried before. Radio traffic crackled with fragments of reports. Paratroopers here, gliders there, none of it forming a clear picture. Dispatch riders roared between command posts in the dark, boots pounding on cobblestones, doors thrown open, telephones ringing in empty corridors. Nobody yet knew whether they were witnessing the opening minutes of the invasion of Europe or an elaborate deception designed to draw them out of position. That uncertainty alone would cost them more than any Allied bullet fired that night. The 21st Panzer was not a paper formation. It was real steel and real men, rebuilt after its original incarnation had been destroyed in the deserts of North Africa 2 years earlier. By June of 1944, it fielded more than 100 Panzer IV tanks, a Panzer Grenadier regiment mounted in half-tracks, and a strong battalion of self-propelled artillery. Commanding it was Lieutenant General Edgar Feuchtinger, a man whose career had been built as much on political connections within the Nazi Party as on battlefield ability. Feuchtinger had organized rallies and parades in Berlin before the war. He had never commanded a division in combat before taking charge of the 21st. On the night the invasion began, he was not even with his headquarters. He was in Paris, and by several post-war accounts he did not return to his command post until well after the first reports of airborne landings had already thrown his staff into confusion, leaving his subordinates to manage a crisis he was not present to see unfold. Beneath him, however, the division had men who had genuinely earned their reputations under fire. Colonel Hans von Luck commanded the Panzer Grenadier Regiment, a veteran of the campaigns in Poland, France, and the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, a man who understood exactly what a fast-moving mechanized force could do to a disorganized enemy if it was unleashed at the right moment. Alongside him, Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski led the division's tank regiment, another Eastern Front veteran, blunt, experienced, and increasingly frustrated as the night wore on and no orders arrived. The division was stationed south and east of the city of Caen, close enough that its lead elements could reach the coast in a matter of hours if given the order to move. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the German defenses along the Atlantic coast, had built his entire strategy around exactly this kind of rapid response. Rommel had fought the Western Allies before, in North Africa, and he understood something many of his colleagues refused to accept, that Germany could not win a long war against the combined industrial power of Britain and the United States. If the invasion could not be thrown back into the sea within the first day, before the Allies could land their heavy armor and consolidate a continuous front, the war in the West was effectively lost. Every hour of delay narrowed the German window to almost nothing. Rommel had said as much to his own staff in the weeks before the landings, warning them that whoever controlled the beaches for the first 24 hours would likely control the outcome of the entire campaign. It was not a metaphor to him. It was arithmetic, built from bitter memory of what Allied air power and naval gunfire had done to his own tanks in the deserts of Egypt and Libya, and he had staked the entire defense of northern France on denying the Allies that same window of time. And yet, as the sun rose that morning over the smoke and noise of the invasion beaches, the 21st Panzer Division sat still. The reason was not cowardice, and it was not incompetence in the ordinary sense. It was structure. In the deeply centralized, deeply paranoid command system of the German armed forces, a division as valuable as the 21st was not simply left to the judgment of its local commanders. It was treated as a strategic reserve, and the release of a strategic reserve required authorization from far above Feuchtinger's level, authorization that, on the morning of June 6th, was nowhere to be found. Adolf Hitler and his closest advisors at his headquarters in Bavaria remained convinced for hours that the landings in Normandy might be a diversion, a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the true invasion, which they still expected at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. Nobody in the German High Command wanted to be the officer who committed the last available armored reserve to the wrong battle. So they waited, and while they waited, according to the version of that morning most often told by historians, the man whose word could have cut through the hesitation and released the armor toward the beaches was still asleep, and no one in his inner circle was prepared to wake him. Meanwhile, on the ground, the tactical picture facing the Germans was almost unbelievably favorable, if only someone had been free to exploit it. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division was fighting its way off the sand under a punishing crossfire, but the greater danger was not the fighting itself, it was the traffic behind it. The narrow exits leading inland from the beach were choked with wrecked vehicles, mines, and concrete obstacles that engineers were still struggling to clear. Landing craft kept arriving on a fixed tidal schedule regardless of the chaos ashore, unloading more trucks, more men, and more equipment onto a strip of sand that had nowhere left to put them. The beach itself had become a slow-moving parking lot of soft-skinned vehicles with almost no room to maneuver. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to untangle jeeps, and trucks jammed nose to tail against burning wrecks, while wounded men were dragged behind whatever cover the seawall still offered. The smell of cordite and diesel smoke hung low over the sand, mixing with salt spray as another wave of landing craft ground ashore, indifferent to the wreckage already choking the beach. A few miles to the west, Canadian troops were fighting an equally brutal battle to secure Juno Beach. Both forces were under orders to push rapidly inland, link their flanks, and seal off a continuous defensive line before the Germans could react. But friction is the oldest law of war, and by mid-morning that link had not happened. Between the advancing British and Canadian spearheads lay an open, undefended corridor of Norman farmland, running like an unlocked door straight from the coast into the rear of both beachheads. For a mechanized division built exactly for this kind of opportunity, the tactical arithmetic could not have been simpler. Drive down that corridor and you are not fighting entrenched anti-tank guns or heavy British armor. You are driving into the exposed flank of disorganized infantry and vulnerable supply columns still bottlenecked on the sand. A concentrated armored thrust through that gap could have rolled up the British position from the side, physically separated the two beachheads from one another, and turned the congestion on the shore into a massacre. Every minute that passed worked against the Germans and for the Allies. Every minute allowed a few more mines to be cleared, a few more vehicles to move off the beach, a few more anti-tank guns to be wrestled into position inland. The door was wide open, but it would not stay open forever, and somewhere behind German lines, the men who might have driven 100 tanks through it were still waiting by their radios for a single word that refused to come. By mid-morning, the crews of the 21st Panzer Division sat inside their vehicles under camouflage netting, engines idling, listening to the distant, endless thunder of naval gunfire rolling in from the coast. Von Luck and von Oppeln-Bronikowski had their formations ready to move at a moment's notice. What they did not have was permission. Feuchtinger, cut off from clear guidance and unwilling to act without it, kept his main striking force in place, releasing only small, scattered infantry detachments that could do little more than harass the edges of the Allied advance. Von Luck reportedly paced beside his own half-track for much of that morning, watching the sky fill with contrails and listening to the naval bombardment grow steadier and closer, every fiber of his training telling him that the single greatest opportunity of his career was slipping away one silent minute at a time. 6 o'clock came and went. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. The single most valuable resource either side possessed that morning was not fuel or ammunition or manpower. It was time, and the Germans were burning through it in a bureaucratic silence, while the men who could have ended the invasion in its cradle sat idle a few miles from the coast, waiting for a phone to ring. When authorization finally did arrive, deep into the morning, it did not send the 21st Panzer's main force racing down that open corridor toward the sea. It sent them somewhere else entirely, toward a threat that seemed, in the chaos and darkness of the previous night, far larger and far more dangerous than it actually was. To understand why the Germans turned away from their greatest opportunity at the exact moment it mattered most, you have to go back to a single bridge, and a single, audacious raid carried out hours before the first Allied soldier ever set foot on the sand. Hours before the first amphibious landing craft ever touched the sand, in the pitch darkness just after midnight, a force of 181 British glider infantrymen carried out one of the most audacious raids of the entire war. Led by Major John Howard of the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, part of the 6th Airborne Division, they crash-landed 3 gliders in tight formation almost on top of their objective, 2 bridges spanning the Caen Canal and the Orne River. The landings themselves were a small miracle of navigation. Plywood and canvas gliders released from their tow planes miles away, gliding silently through the dark and skidding to a stop within yards of the target in a shower of splintered wood and torn earth. Within minutes, Howard's men had overwhelmed the small German garrison and seized both crossings intact, securing what would later become world-famous as Pegasus Bridge. The raid is rightly remembered as a masterpiece of small unit tactics, precise, disciplined, and executed almost exactly as planned. But the way it is usually told misses its true significance. Popular memory imagines a small band of lightly armed paratroopers standing behind a barricade, physically holding back the mechanized might of an entire panzer division through sheer grit alone. The physical reality makes that version impossible. 181 men armed with rifles, submachine guns, and a handful of light anti-tank weapons could not have stopped a concentrated assault by more than 100 tanks and thousands of mechanized infantry. Had the full weight of the 21st Panzer Division been thrown directly down that single approach road, Howard's small force would have been overrun in minutes. Howard's real achievement that night was not building a wall of steel. It was something far more subtle, and in the end, far more devastating to the German defense. By seizing those bridges and holding a firm foothold on the eastern flank of the invasion zone, his men fundamentally distorted the picture forming inside German headquarters. As fragmented, contradictory reports of gliders and parachutes east of the Orne flooded in through the night, regional commanders working from damaged phone lines and panicked radio transmissions could not see the truth on the ground, a single reinforced company holding two bridges. What they believed they were looking at was something else entirely, a major airborne invasion aimed directly at the vulnerable rear of their own defensive line. That misreading triggered an immediate institutional panic. The German command structure, already struggling to grasp the sheer scale of the naval armada gathering off the coast, fixed its attention entirely on this eastern threat. To the officers staring at their situation maps in the dark, the Orne crossings did not look like a minor raid to be mopped up at leisure. They looked like a dagger pointed straight at the flank of the entire German position in Normandy, one that had to be eliminated immediately, before airborne reinforcements could exploit the breach and pour into open country behind the coastal defenses. It is one of the strangest paradoxes of that entire night. While hundreds of Allied ships pounded the coast and tens of thousands of infantrymen prepared to storm ashore, the most urgent item on the desk of several German regional commanders was not the invasion fleet visible from the cliffs. It was a bridge held by fewer than 200 men, several miles inland. Howard's raid had not stopped a panzer division with a roadblock. It had hijacked the perception of an entire army corps at the precise moment that army corps needed absolute clarity to crush the beachhead while it was still weak. To understand how completely that misdirected panic dismantled the German counterattack, picture the eastern bank of the Orne as the morning mist began to burn away. From inside the turrets of their Panzer IV tanks, the veterans of the 21st Panzer Division did not see a desperate, chaotic invasion unfolding around them. They saw an opportunity that looked almost too easy. Elements of the division, spearheaded by von Luck's Panzer Grenadiers and the tank crews of von Oppeln-Bronikowski's regiment, had spent the early hours maneuvering into position with a single, narrow, entirely achievable objective: wipe out the isolated British airborne pocket, holding the bridges before it could be reinforced. From where the tank commanders sat, the tactical picture was simple and reassuring. They were looking at a lightly equipped force of paratroopers with no heavy armor and limited anti-tank weapons, pinned against two waterways with nowhere to retreat. Many of these German crews had survived the brutal mechanized battles of the Eastern Front and the deserts of North Africa. They knew exactly how this kind of operation was supposed to end: mass the armor, bring the self-propelled guns forward, and drive a wedge straight through unsupported infantry. Engines idled, throwing thick exhaust into the damp morning air. Ammunition racks were loaded with high-explosive shells meant to shred infantry positions in the open. Commanders checked their maps, identified their approach routes, and waited for the signal to launch an assault that would have wiped Howard's small force off the map within the hour. In the assembly areas that morning, confidence among the German tank crews was absolute. They had the numbers, they had the armor, and they believed they had the enemy neatly boxed in with nowhere left to run. But modern warfare is rarely decided by the men looking through gun sights on the front line. It is decided miles away, in quiet rooms filled with maps, by officers trying to make sense of a fundamentally chaotic picture. Southwest of the fighting, in the underground command post of the 84th Army Corps at Saint-Lô, General Erich Marx was piecing together a very different and far more alarming picture of the entire Normandy coast. Marx was one of the few senior German officers who had correctly predicted, weeks earlier, that the Allies would strike at Normandy rather than the Pas-de-Calais, and his analytical instincts were now cutting through the fog of war faster than almost anyone else in the German chain of command. As the morning reports solidified, the true scale of the amphibious armada offshore became impossible to dismiss. The localized airborne landings east of the Orne, which had thrown regional commanders into such immediate alarm overnight, were revealed for what they actually were: a supporting operation, not the main event. The true existential danger to the German position was not 181 paratroopers holding two bridges. It was the tens of thousands of British and Canadian soldiers already fighting their way off Sword, Juno, and Gold beaches, backed by the largest naval bombardment ever assembled. Marx looked at his map and saw exactly what the local commanders on the ground could not: the wide, undefended corridor of terrain running from the coast straight down toward the vital city of Caen. If British armor was allowed to push off Sword Beach, secure that corridor, and capture Caen, it would break out into the open tank country of central France and unravel the entire German defensive strategy in a matter of days. Then he looked at the disposition of his own forces and understood the terrible irony of the moment. The only mechanized force capable of striking that vulnerable landing before it hardened, the 21st Panzer Division, was sitting on the wrong side of the river entirely, preparing to swat a fly on the eastern flank, while the true danger broke through the front door to the north. It was mid-morning. The German tank commanders east of the Orne were making their final checks, waiting for the flare that would signal the advance against Howard's bridgehead. Instead, a radio operator handed over a frantic, high-priority transmission that defied every instinct of local tactical logic. The order had cascaded down from Marx, through Feuchtinger's paralyzed divisional headquarters, directly to the regimental commanders in the field. Abort the attack on the airborne bridgehead immediately. Disengage all armored units. Turn the entire division around, cross back to the western bank of the Orne, drive north through the city of Caen, and launch a counterattack against the Allied forces advancing from the coast. For the veteran commanders sitting in their tank turrets, the order was almost incomprehensible. They had a vulnerable surrounded enemy directly in their sights. Artillery was already ranged in. Infantry was ready to dismount and finish the job. Abandoning a prepared attack at the last possible second went against every instinct a mechanized officer possessed. It meant surrendering the initiative, giving up a guaranteed local victory, and completely rewriting the battle plan in the middle of an operation already underway. But in the rigid, top-down hierarchy of the German army, an order was an order. The confidence that had filled the assembly areas that morning evaporated instantly, replaced by furious frustration. Commanders grabbed their radio microphones and issued the hardest command any armored officer can give his men: stop, pack it up, turn around. The psychological shock of that sudden reversal was immense, but it was nothing compared to the physical nightmare of actually carrying it out. Reversing the direction of a fully equipped Panzer division is not a matter of simply turning steering wheels. A mechanized division of this size is a colossal, lumbering machine of logistics: more than 100 tanks, hundreds of half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and thousands of men, all of it now required to disentangle itself from an assault formation, reform into march columns, and move in an entirely new direction under time pressure that could not be negotiated. The division could not simply cut across open farmland in a straight line toward its new objective. To reach the high ground north of Caen, it had to cross the waterways, and to cross the waterways, it had to funnel almost its entire strength directly through the city of Caen itself. Caen was not a wide, modern highway. It was an ancient, densely built medieval city of narrow streets and tight intersections, and on that particular morning it was something far worse. Allied heavy bombers had spent the night and early morning systematically pounding the city's infrastructure, trying to sever the exact roads and rail lines the Germans would now be forced to use. As the vanguard of the 21st Panzer Division approached the outskirts, they did not find streets. They found an apocalyptic landscape of shattered masonry, collapsed timber, and deep bomb craters. Thick black smoke poured from burning buildings, blotting out the midday sun and turning daylight into a choking twilight of dust and cinder. When the lead tanks, each nearly 10 feet wide, tried to push into the narrow urban corridors, the careful choreography of a mechanized advance collapsed almost instantly into a crawling, chaotic traffic jam. The friction of war took absolute control. Tank tracks ground painfully against mountains of rubble, tearing up what remained of the pavement and throwing sparks into air already thick with dust. Drivers peering through narrow armored slits were blinded by swirling smoke and pulverized masonry kicked up by the vehicles ahead of them. To keep their machines from crashing into debris or into each other, tank commanders were forced to open their hatches, exposing themselves to falling stone, choking heat, and the constant threat of Allied fighter bombers circling overhead, just to guide their drivers forward by shouting over the deafening roar of overheating engines. The city became a suffocating bottleneck. The single, unified armored fist of the 21st Panzer Division was forced to string itself out into a thin, agonizingly slow column. Formations broke apart from one another. Regiments were separated from their own supply columns. Radio communication, already strained, grew fragmented and unreliable as signals struggled to penetrate the burning urban wreckage and the metallic chaos surrounding them. Vehicles that broke down or overheated in the intense heat of the fires could not simply be pushed aside. They became solid steel roadblocks in their own right, forcing the entire column behind them to halt while recovery crews fought to clear a path. Thousands of terrified French civilians, fleeing the bombardment with whatever possessions they could carry, were caught in the ruined streets as well, further clogging the intersections and forcing the tanks to crawl forward with agonizing caution to avoid crushing the very people they claimed to be defending. Finding the surviving bridges over the Orne and the canal became a desperate logistical puzzle, with the division's entire tonnage forced to squeeze across narrow choke points, one vehicle at a time. Inside the buttoned-up tanks, the heat became almost unbearable, air filters choking on dust, tempers fraying, elite frontline soldiers reduced to fighting a grinding battle against rubble and architecture, while the actual enemy remained miles away. Men who had survived Stalingrad's winter and the burning sands outside Tobruk now found themselves cursing at broken paving stones and collapsed shop fronts, their training utterly useless against a city that refused to get out of their way. As the tanks inched forward, the clock kept moving with a cruelty no amount of German discipline could overcome. 10 o'clock bled into 11, 11 stretched into noon, noon dragged into early afternoon. Every single minute the 21st Panzer Division spent wrestling with the ruins of Caen was a minute that belonged entirely to the British. Because while the German armored spearhead sat paralyzed in urban wreckage, the situation on the Normandy coast was being completely transformed. At Sword Beach, the chaotic, vulnerable parking lot of the early morning was being systematically dismantled. Specialized armored vehicles of the 79th Armored Division, flail tanks beating the sand with heavy chains to detonate mines, armored bulldozers clearing concrete obstacles, and bridge-laying tanks spanning anti-tank ditches, had finally forced open multiple safe exits from the shoreline. The bottleneck at the water's edge was untangling, and crucially, the heavy armor the Allies desperately needed to survive a counterattack was now rolling steadily off the landing craft and onto French soil. Waterproofed Sherman tanks of the Staffordshire Yeomanry and other armored regiments shook off the salt water and pushed inland, not wandering aimlessly, but executing a carefully rehearsed defensive doctrine. British commanders knew a German armored counterattack was the single greatest threat to their survival, and they knew almost exactly where it would come from. As infantry battalions pushed south, they made directly for the high ground of Perrier's Ridge, a subtle but commanding elevation overlooking the roads leading out of the northern outskirts of Caen, the exact corridor the 21st Panzer Division would be forced to use once it finally escaped the city. With frantic energy, the British built a wall. Infantrymen dug slit trenches into the chalky soil, turning the ridge into a fortified line. Royal artillery crews rushed anti-tank guns forward, hauling agile six-pounders into camouflaged positions among the hedgerows. More critically, they wrestled heavy 17-pounder anti-tank guns into place as well, weapons capable of punching through the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at long range, their barrels sighted straight down the roads leading back toward Caen. Sherman tanks maneuvered into hull-down positions behind the crests of the hills, hiding their vulnerable lower hulls behind the earth and exposing only their armored turrets, transforming themselves into protected strongpoints with overlapping fields of fire. The entire nature of the battlefield inverted during those lost hours. In the middle of the morning, the 21st Panzer Division could have driven straight into the exposed flanks of disorganized infantry, still struggling to clear a chaotic beach. By mid-afternoon, that same battlefield had become a deeply entrenched, layered, steel-reinforced front line. The narrow window of vulnerability that Rommel's entire defensive doctrine had depended upon was being systematically and irreversibly welded shut, hour by hour, while German tanks fought a losing battle against their own ruined city. It was pushing toward mid-afternoon when the vanguard of the 21st Panzer Division finally broke free from the smoke-filled wreckage of Caen. Covered in white masonry dust, engines running hot, crews exhausted from the physical toll of navigating the urban wreckage, the armored columns began to reassemble on the northern outskirts, near the high ground of Lebesay Wood. Colonel von Oppeln-Bronikowski climbed up out of his turret, raised his field glasses, and looked toward the coast. What he saw was the quiet death of German operational momentum. The gentle slopes leading down toward the English Channel were no longer empty, inviting avenues of attack. Through his lenses, he could make out the distinct silhouettes of British Sherman tanks positioned hull down along the ridgeline, the freshly turned earth of anti-tank positions dug into the hedgerows, and a steady, uninterrupted flow of Allied reinforcements moving inland from the beaches, completely unmolested. Above it all, the sky was thick with the unmistakable shapes of Allied fighter bombers, Hawker Typhoons and Supermarine Spitfires, circling like predatory birds, holding absolute air supremacy and waiting to pounce with rockets and cannon fire. The instant German armor exposed itself in the open. Those lost hours spent reversing the division and fighting through the rubble of Caen had cost the Germans the single most irreplaceable asset in armored warfare, the element of surprise. They were no longer executing a rapid, overwhelming thrust into a soft and undefended flank. Because of institutional paralysis and the friction of war, they were now being asked to launch a direct frontal assault against a prepared, entrenched enemy holding the high ground. The unified, crushing blow that could have shattered the invasion on the sand that morning had been diluted by delay into a desperate uphill fight against an enemy growing stronger with every passing minute. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, at Perrières-sur-le-Don, the main armored fist of the 21st Panzer Division finally advanced. Directly into the interlocking fire zones the British had spent the entire day preparing. As the Panzer IV tanks crested the low rise, they were met by a solid wall of high-velocity, armor-piercing fire. British 17-pounder anti-tank guns, hidden in the hedgerows, and Sherman Firefly tanks, firing from protected positions, dismantled the advancing formation with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the unified counterattack that was supposed to sweep the British into the sea lay shattered, burning tanks throwing thick columns of oily black smoke into the afternoon sky, marking the death of the German division's primary effort. But the Normandy battlefield was never a tidy, continuous line, and even a broken plan can leave room for accident. While the main armored corps was being destroyed on the ridge, a separate combat group operating further to the west experienced a completely different reality. A battle group built around the 1st Battalion of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, supported by a handful of surviving tanks, had swung northwest through the countryside, expecting at any moment to run headlong into the same wall of British steel that had just gutted their comrades to the east. Instead, they found nothing. Threading almost by accident through the farmland, this small combat group had stumbled directly into the exact geographical seam between the British forces expanding outward from Sword Beach and the Canadian forces pushing inland from Juno. Because both Allied units had faced such heavy resistance during their own landings, their inner flanks had not yet linked up. The German column was suddenly rolling down a completely undefended corridor, bypassing isolated pockets of resistance, ignoring the risk to its own flanks, and pressing relentlessly north. By 8 o'clock that evening, they achieved what no other German unit would manage that day. The lead half-tracks and tanks rolled to a halt in the coastal area between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer, their treads grinding into the sand just short of the waterline. German soldiers climbed down from their vehicles and looked out over the English Channel. Before them lay the almost unimaginable scale of the Allied armada, thousands of ships stretching to the horizon in every direction, against every expectation created by the chaos of that long, broken day. This isolated vanguard had done something no other German force would achieve on June 6th. They had reached the sea. For a moment, standing in the wind coming off the channel, the soldiers of that small battle group could almost believe they had won. The evening light was fading over the water, gulls wheeling low over the surf, and somewhere behind them the sound of naval guns had begun to slacken as the day's fighting wound down. It was the kind of quiet that comes only after chaos, deceptive, fragile, and about to be broken in a way none of them could yet imagine. But as the light continued to fade over the dunes near Lyon-sur-Mer, the true weight of their situation began to press down on the officers of that isolated German battle group. They had driven a wedge between the British and the Canadians, but a wedge is only as good as the force behind it, and there was no force behind it. The main strength of the 21st Panzer Division lay miles to the south, burned out and shattered in front of Perrier's Ridge. This small column of Panzer Grenadiers and a handful of surviving tanks was now stretched dangerously thin, occupying a narrow corridor that pointed directly into the heart of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Behind them lay open farmland and hedgerows already crawling with Allied patrols. Ahead of them lay nothing but sand, surf, and an armada too vast to comprehend from a single stretch of dune grass. Somewhere out past the surf line, the silhouettes of destroyers and transport ships stretched on until they simply dissolved into the darkening horizon, a sight that made the isolation of a few hundred exhausted men feel almost absurd by comparison. Exploiting a breakthrough of this scale required immediate reinforcement and clear communication with higher command. The men on that beach had neither. Frantic attempts to raise divisional headquarters over the radio were met with static and fragments of panicked chatter from other units. Listening east toward Sword Beach and west toward Juno, the soldiers could hear the steady grinding of Allied tank treads and the deep, rolling thunder of naval artillery still tearing at the countryside. The gap they had slipped through was not a door standing quietly open. It was a vice slowly tightening, as British and Canadian forces continued expanding their beachheads, closing the space behind them hour by hour. Every burst of static on the radio set off a fresh wave of tension inside the command half-track, officers leaning close over the handset, straining to catch a single coherent word through the interference before giving up and staring back out at the darkening tree lines. The psychological pressure of that isolation was already wearing at the German officers when, shortly before 9 that evening, the sky itself seemed to tear open. A low, droning hum rolling in from the channel built rapidly into an earth-shaking roar. The soldiers on the coast looked up into the darkening sky and saw a spectacle few of them would ever forget. A colossal formation of Allied aircraft sweeping directly overhead, barely above the rooftops, towing an endless stream of massive gliders that seemed to blot out what remained of the evening light. This was, in reality, the second major lift of the British 6th Airborne Division, bringing desperately needed reinforcements and heavy equipment to solidify the eastern flank of the invasion, a scheduled, carefully planned operation with nothing to do with the isolated German vanguard standing on the dunes below. But to men who had spent the entire day being surprised, misled, and outmaneuvered, it did not look like a routine reinforcement drop. It looked like a perfectly timed trap closing shut around them. As they watched the gliders bank sharply and begin their descent into fields to the south, a terrifying illusion took hold. The German commanders became convinced that the Allies were deliberately dropping an airborne wall directly behind their position, sealing off the only avenue of escape left to them. The fear of being completely surrounded and annihilated in that narrow strip of coastline overwhelmed whatever tactical discipline remained. Without being able to reach a headquarters that might have offered a clearer picture, and without firing a single shot to exploit the extraordinary position they had fought all day to reach, the local commander gave the order: retreat. The Panzer Grenadiers scrambled back into their half-tracks. The surviving tanks threw their gears into reverse. They abandoned the dunes, turned their backs on the invasion fleet stretching to the horizon, and raced south, desperate to escape the corridor before the airborne noose they believed was tightening could close completely. The only German unit to reach the water on D-Day had voluntarily surrendered the single greatest tactical opportunity of the entire battle, driven away not by British guns but by the shadow of an airborne operation that was never actually aimed at them. By nightfall, the gap between Sword and Juno beaches was firmly back in Allied hands. The German wedge, so hard won and so briefly held, had simply vanished into the dark, leaving nothing behind but flattened dune grass and tire tracks already filling with blown sand. So what does this strange, forgotten episode actually tell us about the battle for Normandy? The failure of that isolated German vanguard at Lyon-sur-Mer was not a failure of tactics on the ground. They did not lose because they were outgunned on the sand, or because a wall of Allied tanks physically blocked their path to the water. They failed because by the time their treads finally touched the shoreline, they were nothing more than a fractured, exhausted fragment of a division that had spent the entire day fighting its own high command rather than the enemy. That reality brings the story full circle, back to the dark early hours of June 6th and the quietly misunderstood legacy of Major John Howard and his 181 glider infantrymen. For decades, the capture of Pegasus Bridge has been remembered as a triumph of small unit courage, a story of a handful of soldiers holding a vital crossing against impossible odds. Looking at the wider battlefield, though, reveals a far more significant achievement hiding beneath the familiar story. Howard's men did not defeat the 21st Panzer Division in direct combat. They never placed a physical barrier in front of 100 tanks and simply stopped them from reaching the coast by force. Their true victory was quieter and far more consequential than that. They destroyed the enemy's timetable. By dropping silently out of the night sky and securing a foothold on the eastern flank, those British soldiers triggered a massive operational disruption inside a notoriously rigid command structure. They forced regional commanders to treat a small, localized raid as a catastrophic threat to their rear, and in doing so, scrambled the tactical judgment of an entire Army Corps at the exact moment unified clarity was needed most. That single, well-executed raid forced the only mechanized force capable of shattering the Allied beachhead to abort its own attack, reverse its heavy columns in the middle of an operation, and burn 3.5 irreplaceable hours grinding through the bombed-out ruins of Caen. Because of that delay, what should have been a devastating, unified armored thrust down an undefended corridor at mid-morning, while the beaches were still choked with confusion, was instead diluted into a series of late, disjointed attacks against a fortified line in the mid-afternoon. The battle for the Normandy coast was never only a battle fought over strips of sand. It was, in its first and most decisive hours, a battle fought over time and coordination, and Germany lost that battle before a single German tank ever reached the water. Germany did not lose its greatest opportunity to repel the invasion because its tanks were too far away, or because its soldiers lacked courage or skill. It lost that opportunity because institutional paranoia, a fractured chain of command, and 181 British paratroopers holding a bridge in the dark robbed the 21st Panzer Division of the one resource no army can ever recover once it is spent: time itself. The men at the center of that failed day carried its consequences with them long after the guns fell silent. Edgar Feuchtinger's command of the 21st Panzer Division did not survive the summer. Later in 1944, he was tried by a German military court on charges of corruption and unauthorized absence from his post, sentenced to death, and spared only when Hitler personally commuted the sentence, a strange, bitter footnote for the general whose hesitation on the morning of the invasion had already cost his division its one great chance. Hans von Luck fought on until he was captured by Soviet forces in the closing months of the war and spent 5 long years in a prison camp in the Caucasus before finally returning home. In the decades that followed, in one of the quieter ironies of the entire Normandy campaign, von Luck became a close personal friend of Major John Howard, the very officer whose small raid on the bridges over the Orne had helped set his division's disastrous day in motion. Two men who had once maneuvered against each other in the darkness and confusion of June 6 spent their later years exchanging letters and swapping stories, the war between them long since settled into history. And yet the German army did, in the end, achieve something remarkable on the evening of June 6th. A small battered fragment of that same division slipped through the chaos of the battlefield, severed the fragile seam between two invading armies, and physically stood on the shore of the English Channel, exactly as Rommel's doctrine had demanded. But modern mechanized warfare runs on a ruthless equation in which time is the only currency that matters, and because of a handful of glider troops holding a bridge before dawn and 3 irreplaceable hours burned in the smoking rubble of their own city, that historic breakthrough arrived already hollow. By the time those forward units finally stood on the dunes near Lyon-sur-Mer, staring out at the vast, unimaginable shape of the Allied invasion fleet, their division's main strength lay wrecked in front of Perrier's Ridge. Their strategic window had slammed permanently shut, and their moment of triumph had already become something far smaller and far sadder than victory. A brief, isolated glimpse of a war the 21st Panzer Division had already lost hours earlier, in the ruins of a city they were never meant to be fighting through at all, undone not by the tanks and guns waiting for them on the ridge, but by a handful of hours no army, however powerful, can ever buy back once they are gone.